Have you ever wondered what would happen if you combined Miss Pac-Man with Splatoon? Paint Chase is exactly that. This is UFO number 4. According to the history, this is the game that put the hardware specialist Jerry Smolsky on the map, and boy, does he deserve all of the fictional recognition. This is really an awesome game. In this game, you are a race car driver who shoots out paint behind you. You're trying to cover up the map with more of your paint than anything else. It's not necessarily trying to cover up the red, but of course the red people are trying to cover over your paint, so you want to take care of these enemies as fast as possible. The levels are pretty tricky. There's 25 total, and they are not randomly generated. These are all distinct levels that have a particular pattern to them. If you are very good at the game, you can probably replicate your performance in each of the maps. So if you're looking to get an easy cherry, you could probably look up some guides pretty easily. I did mine the hard way, and it was tough. This was not a game that I was easily able to master. It took me about 4.5 to 5 hours, I would say, give or take, and I had a blast doing it. It's a game that utilizes the movement style of Miss Pac-Man, in that you can actually pre-game your movements by holding the directional pad ahead of time. For example, you go straight forward just by pressing up, but you can hold the left D-pad to make a left turn as soon as you're able to. I have to say, I think this is a really underutilized movement scheme, especially for an arcade game. I can't think of any game outside of the Pac-Man series that utilizes movement like this, and it's hard to see why. It's really satisfying and fun, particularly with the innovation of this being a car, which means you cannot just do a 180. You have to actually do 3-point turns or move counterclockwise to actually get to the movement you need to. So yeah, it's actually punishing to be in a spot where you can't just move around easily, and that's a lot of the fun of the game. In fact, there are all these little speed ups you can take, which will increase your speed, and as a hidden mechanic, you can ramp up the speed longer and faster just by doing loop-de-loops and chaining them. It's a really satisfying mechanic. The other thing that's really cool about this game, of course, is the power-up system. So by driving over one of these tiles, you can collect things like a drone that helps you paint, being able to shoot out spikes to kill enemies, being able to shoot paint everywhere to help you fill up the map, or even stop time. I did not understand what let you reuse these power-ups. At first I thought it was maybe time passing, or perhaps a certain number of invisible points. Maybe you get 1 point for painting your spot over a tile, and if you got a certain amount, you could get it more. What I actually realized, and this is so freaking brilliant, if the enemies repaint your tile, then you can paint it over again. So what really matters to trigger it is turning it blue, right? Whether it's neutral or whether it's red, once you paint over that tile and turn it blue, you can use it. So there's a really interesting tension in certain levels, right? Maybe powerful abilities like stopping time, you might want to use them at the start of the map because there's a good chance that an enemy will come and paint over it and you can utilize it a second time. Or maybe you want to wait to the last minute because the last minute is going to be the most impactful in terms of your overall score. So a really interesting give or take. And if you're lucky enough to have your active power up while it gets repainted over, you can actually level up your power up to a second level, which is extremely rare, but extremely fun. The enemies are tricky. They definitely do require a lot of different tactics. They start off really simple, like just fellow cars who drive around, but then they get really obnoxious, like enemies that have spikes on the front side, so you have to hit them from the side or from the back if you want to kill them. You've also got these like Gordo, curvy looking enemies that shoot out spikes once they make line of sight with you. The cool thing about those guys is that you can chain the needles into killing other enemies. That's one of the better strategies to do, but of course, it's hard to move in this game. You can break, and that's one of the few times you probably do want to break, but at the same time, if you're not moving fast enough, you're not going to be getting points, but then if you die, you're going to be losing a good chunk of time that could be doing it. So there's this interesting tension of how am I planning my movement, right? And again, because these levels are not randomly generated, it really rewards practice. If you want to get the cherry and if you want to get a lot of points, because you need 500 points to get the cherry run, you do have to really understand what enemies are spawning, what are good tactics, and that's just one of the big joys of the game, frankly. Now, I called the game a lot like Miss Pac-Man earlier. Another reason why it feels like that is because there are little cutscenes that play every 5 levels or so. They're really cute and charming. There's no dialogue at all, but you can get a sense of the frustration that your main little racer feels in competition with other people. At the end, there's a particularly satisfying credit sequence that really makes this feel like the developers of the LX system cracked the code and realized that presentation is a huge part of the game itself. And the inpick right before this was pretty good in that there was a cutscene when you first start the game up, but nothing really much more than that. There was one song that looped over and over again, and that's true of Paint Chase as well. But still, it's really cool to see this fun little credit sequence go out. I think Jerry Smolsky really did a bang-up job coming up with Paint Chase. I had a blast with it. I will say, too, at the very end of the game, you get to fight against a fellow racer. It's basically your rival, and this is arguably the most fun match in the entire game. It's a shame it's at the very end because it's tricky to get there. A lot of the levels can be really difficult. If you are unfortunate enough to get stuck on one of those levels where you need 70% or more, it can be really tricky. And the funny thing about Paint Chase 2 is that the difficulty is not really even. I find that some of the earlier levels in the 6 to 10 range end up being harder than the 15 to 20 range. Say what you will, there is something to be said about learning the mechanics of the game and realizing, okay, you probably want to kill enemies. That's probably the best strategy overall if you're trying to get the most paint, because the longer enemies are around, the more they're going to do damage to your blue paint. But still, what makes the final boss so satisfying is that it's a replica of you. So they can copy over the powers the same way that you can. One of the best strategies in this fight is to grab the offensive stuff, painting those needles, and just going to town that way. Killing the enemy is, again, one of the best strategies you can do in this game. Then you can grab the drone, and then you can start painting over things. But that's where I realized that the power-up system is paint-based, because I couldn't understand how it was that they kept going back and forth like that, right? So really, really cool fight. Makes me wonder if two-player mode is competitive like that. I don't think a co-op mode for Paint Chase would be nearly as fun as just going to town head-to-head, painting as much as you can, trying to get the power-ups in the certain ways you could. I'd be really curious how many maps there are too. In fact, if you in the comments have played two-player mode, would love to know what your thoughts on it. But again, Paint Chase, just fun, really simple. The combination of Miss Pac-Man and Splatoon is honestly like a slam dunk in terms of simplicity, while also being high octane and a lot of fun. The movement feels like a car in a really satisfying way. It's not choppy, it's really fluid. And I think the power-up system is just simple but deep enough to really reward understanding the gameplay. The wide range of enemies is super cool. I never even touched over the slimes earlier. They're my favorite enemy because the game wants you to go fast. The faster you go, the more you can paint over. But if you're going too fast on the slimes, you wipe out, which has this really hysterical animation to it. And it's actually even worse than that because you just spread red paint everywhere. I think the funniest things that happen in the game are basically in the levels with the slimes, where you're trying to balance going too fast, but they're not going fast enough. Really fun game. Do I like it more than Barbuda is a great question. I think I'm going to give it the exact same score of 6 Barbudas. I did like Paint Chase a lot. If you haven't been keeping up with us, we are doing a weekly UFO 50 game every single week, playing them one at a time. So in the comments, please be mindful of spoilers because I'm not playing future games. I'm going through them in order. We gave Barbuda 6 Barbudas because that was, the starting life system. And that's the metric that I'm using to compare all other games in the series to. Bug Hunter, I loved. I gave it 8 Barbudas. Ninpek was solid too. I gave it 4. So we got a pretty good range here. And to be frank with you, even these mini games in UFO 50 just feel more fun than most AAA games that I've been playing in the past 5 or 6 years. Yeah, highly recommend Paint Chase. Very curious about two-player mode. Let me know what you think. Can't wait to see you next week for Magic Garden. See you there, Scouts.